Theocracy is just another form of dictatorship. Theory and Evidence from the Papal Regimes by Fabio Padovano, Condorcet Center for Political Economy and Crime, CNRS, Université de Rennes 1, and DIPES, Universitario Matre and Ronald, Wintrobe, University of Western Ontario. Abstract: This paper tests the explanatory and predictive power of a theory of dictatorship, for example, Wintrobe 1998, 2007, when applied to the case of theocracy and in particular to the history of the temporal power of the popes. We considered the behavior of the Catholic theocracy in the Papal States, as this was a very long-lasting theocracy, exposed to many historical shocks that reveal information about the incentives and constraints that characterize it. We use this information to test the explanatory power of the theory of dictatorship, showing that never in the history of the temporal power of the Church have the four categories of dictatorship that the theory foresees, tinpot, tyrant, totalitarian and conceivably timocrat, proven inadequate. Theocracy is just like any other form of dictatorship. Furthermore, we test some of the predictions of the theory of dictatorship about the durability of, and the source of opposition to the various regimes on data about the papacy. The results appear to support the theory.
Introduction: There are two basically different ways to think about theocracy in general or about particular theocratic regimes. One is that theocracies are essentially dictatorships. In this way of thinking, the religious dimension of theocratic authority provides an important source of loyalty to the regime, but this functions no differently than other sources of legitimacy or authority in other dictatorial regimes. Wintrobe and Padovano 2009. The other is that the tension, complementarity or opposition between the two sources of authority, religious and secular, give theocratic regimes a sufficiently different flavor that they warrant a separate classification. Caddy, 2006. Bernhals, 2001. Ferrero, 2009. In this paper we take the first view, that theocracies are dictatorships, and apply a particular model of dictatorship, Wintrobe's 1990, 1998, Political Exchange Model 1, to the case of theocracy. To substantiate this claim, we apply the political exchange model to the longest-lived and most famous of all theocracies, the papacy. We conduct two tests. In the first, we evaluate the explanatory power of the model, applying its analytical structures to the history of the temporal power of the popes. This first test suggests that the four types of dictatorial regimes indicated by the model, tinpot, totalitarian, tyrannical and democratic, are enough to explain the structural changes that the papacy underwent during that 1,300 years long period. Drawing on this characterization of the papal regimes, we verify the predictive power of the political exchange model, testing two empirical restrictions. The first is that tinpot popes are weaker and therefore should be shorter-lived regimes compared to tyrannical and totalitarian popes. The second is that power-maximizing, totalitarian popes pose a more serious threat to, and are thus more likely to be opposed by, other political powers, like the empires in the Middle Age and the nation-states in more recent times, as the election of an anti-pope is probably the most serious challenge to the legitimacy of a pope. The model predicts that the probability of having an anti-pope is higher during totalitarian papacies than during tinpot or tyrannical ones. The paper hopes to add to the rather sparse analytical literature on theocracy. Some other rational choice perspectives can be found and in the recent collection by Ferrero and Wintrobe, 2009. Of course, there are many, often important, studies of particular regimes. Some examples of the latter are Caddy, 2006, on the regime in contemporary Iran, that discussion of the ancient Jewish theocracy in Finer, 1997, and the vast literature on the papacy, of which Duffy, 2006, is a particularly insightful recent history. The rest of the paper is organized as follows. The following section summarizes Wintrobe's model of dictatorship, and shows how the four types of regime can be derived from a general framework. Section 3 extends that model to theocracy. In Section 4 we look at the explanatory power of the model for the case of the Papal States by showing that the four dictatorial types suffice to describe the history of the papal theocracy. In Section 5 we test the predictive power of the model looking at the durability and at the source of opposition of the various papal regimes. Section 6 summarizes the main conclusions of our analysis. 2. Theoretical grounds. The classic view of the difference between democracy and dictatorship in political science. For example, Friedrich and Brzezinski, 1956, is that dictators stay in power only through repression, but rule by repression alone creates a problem for the autocrat. This is the dictator's dilemma. Wintrobe, 1998. The problem facing any ruler of knowing how much support he has among the general population, as well as among smaller groups with the power to depose him. The use of repression breeds fear on the part of a dictator's subjects, and this fear breeds a reluctance on the part of the citizenry to signal displeasure with the dictator's policies. This fear on their part in turn breeds fear on the part of the dictator, since, not knowing what the population thinks of his policies, he has no way of knowing what they are thinking and planning, and of course he suspects that what they are thinking and planning is his overthrow. The problem is magnified the more the dictator rules through repression and fear. But the problem is not impossible to solve. Successful dictators resolve it through buying or accumulating loyalty among different groups in the population, especially among those with the capacity to depose him. That dictatorships use two instruments, repression and loyalty, to stay in power provides a useful classification of regimes. Four types can be distinguished: tin pots, tyrants, totalitarians, and democrats. Totalitarian regimes combine high repression with a capacity to generate loyalty. Under tyranny, the regime stays in power through high repression alone and loyalty is low. A tin pot regime is low on both counts, while a democracy implies that loyalty is high even at low levels of repression. These correspond to the four types or images of dictatorship mentioned that Wintrobe, 1998, suggested have tended to recur over and over, though often under different names, in the literature on dictatorship. The different types of regimes can each be derived from a more general framework. Wintrobe, 1998, Chapter 5. Suppose now that all dictators have the same utility function too, whose arguments are consumption, c, and power, idiosis. The dictator is constrained in two ways. The first constraint is the costs of accumulating power. This is governed by the prices of repression and loyalty, PR and PL. These, in turn, depend on the political institutions of the regime. Whether there is a mass party, whether the police and the army are subservient to it, and so on. This constraint is illustrated by the upward sloping curve idiosis degrees, B idiosis C, in Figure 1, implying a positive relationships between the dictator's total budget B, minus expenditures on C, and the level of idiosis obtained. This curve shows how the dictator can convert money into power. Figure 1 above here. The second constraint is the ruler's capacity to use his power to increase revenue, as summarized by the B idiosis degrees curve in Figure 1. This curve describes the relationships between the exercise of political power and its consequences for the dictator's budget. That is, the conversion, in effect, of power into money. There are many ways for a government to convert power into money. The most obvious are through taxation, regulation or the provision of public goods that raise national income. It seems reasonable to assume that, initially, the power-to-money curve BIDRSS must be positively sloped, starting from very low, or zero, levels of power. The provision of basic public infrastructure or the imposition of simple taxes at low rates must raise revenue. After some point, however, further exercise of power must ultimately lower the budget by reducing the efficiency of the economy, therefore lowering national income and tax revenues. Equilibrium in Figure 1 is at the intersection of the BIDRSS degrees, and IDRSS degrees, BIDRSS curves, or at T0, implying a total budget of B and power equal to IDRSS 3 in a modern theocracy like Iran. See Wintrobe and Padovano 2009, where the economic role of the theocracy is to impose restrictions on economic activity like laws against usury. It seems reasonable to assume that equilibrium will be in a region where BIDRSS degrees is downward sloping. In the case of the Papal States, at a time when governments were relatively primitive and public goods lacking, it seems likely that an increase in the power of the Pope would increase the revenues of the government. For simplicity, in this paper we will assume that this is generally the case. The consequences of relaxing this assumption are straightforward and will be pointed out where appropriate. One side of the level of IDRSS or the budget is set. The dictator chooses the optimum levels of repression R and loyalty L. This is shown in Figure 2, where, given equilibrium values for IDRSS and B, the prices of loyalty L, of repression R and the marginal productivities of R and L in producing IDRSS, R and L, are determined. This analysis thus jointly determines the dictator's optimal levels of R, LCB, and IDRSS. In turn, changes in the capacity to raise revenue or to repress dissent, the supply of loyalty, the dictator's consumption level, or any other variable entering into the equilibrium changes its nature. Thus whether a regime is a tin pot, low repression, low loyalty, a tyranny, high repression, low loyalty, or totalitarian, high repression and high loyalty, depends on these more basic factors. This is explicitly shown in Figure 2. Depending on the quadrant, the regime turns out to one of the four types of regime. Theocracy. Now let us apply this model to the case of theocracy. Theocracies to stay in power through the use of the instruments of repression and loyalty. In particular, they can use the power of belief in the religion as an important way to provide a source of loyalty to their regime. How this works depends on the type of religion. Three notable sources of religious power are the priestly class, the holy book and sponsorship of the arts, in the case of the Catholic religion in particular. 3.1. The priestly class. Theocratic rule usually involves the dominance of a priestly class, the leaders of the church in the regime of Calvin, the rabbinate in the case of the Jews, the cardinals, bishops and popes in the papacy, and the religious clerics in the case of contemporary Iran. They may rule directly, as Calvin did, or indirectly as in the case of modern Iran. In either case, their religious authority is obviously an enormous source of power, but their authority rests normally on tradition and on sources like the Holy Book. This tends to make them conservative and therefore unresponsive to innovation. They try to buttress their authority in various ways, as discussed in the following sections. 3.2 The Church as sponsor of the arts. Many of the activities of the Catholic Church in this respect are easily interpretable as attempts to establish the Church's reputation for being the true representative of the one God, in the same way that costly expenditures on the copyright core are viewed as signals of quality of the product in the model of Klein and Leffler, 1981-5. Duffy, 2006. Shows that the Pope Nicholas V thought of things in this manner. In a speech to the cardinals from his deathbed in 1455 he emphasized that his buildings were to be sermons in stone, layman's books. The learned who had studied antiquity could truly understand the greatness and authority of Rome, but to create solid and stable convictions in the minds of the uncultured masses, there must be something that appeals to the eye. A popular faith, sustained only on doctrines, will never be anything but feeble and vacillating. But if the authority of the Holy See were visibly displayed in majestic buildings, imperishable memorials and witnesses seemingly planted by the hand of God Himself, belief would grow and strengthen like a tradition. From one generation to another, and all the world would accept and revere it. Duffy, 2006, p. 181. According to Duffy, these words in many ways provided the manifesto for the Renaissance papacy. 3.3 The book. Thirdly, in all of the monotheistic religions, one of the most important ways to buttress the claim to represent the one God is via the Holy Book. The Old Testament, the New Testament, the Quran, etc. The Holy Book provides the authority that the Church uses to buttress its claim by telling the story of the relationship of God to man. Thus many of the prophets depicted in the Sistine Chapel are shown with an enormous book, either reading it, gazing at it, or simply holding it. Another point is that the Holy Book then also serves as a check on the organized religion or the government. Samuel Feiner, 1997, thus describes the ancient Jewish kingdom as the first constitutional monarchy, because the religious groups could consult the Bible to see if the actions of the king were in accordance with it, and if not, they could disobey and oppose them. This point is elaborated in O'Leary, 2009, with respect to theocracy in general. 6. Papal regimes. 4.1, Logic of the analysis. In this section we examine how well the political exchange model of dictatorship explains the behavior of the papal theocracy. Specifically, we provide some evidence that theocracy is not a distinct class of dictatorship. Rather, it may fit into any of the four categories of dictatorship studied in Wintrobe, 1990, 1998, democratic, tin pot, tyrant, and totalitarian. As we have suggested above, the only differences between theocracy and standard dictatorships are the nature of the base of loyalty and the effects of restrictions on economic activity, possibly compensated by a capacity to generate internal repression that could affect economic life and performance. These shift the power into money and money into power functions, thus generating different equilibrium levels of loyalty and repression and the features that distinguish the types of dictatorship. To substantiate this claim we look at the history of the most durable, in fact, with the so far kept promise of eternity, and far-reaching example of theocracy, the papacy. The choice of the papacy as a testing ground offers two main advantages. First, the history of the papacy is very long and very well documented, by historians of all periods, countries, religions and persuasions, among the many, Kelly 1989, Hilaire, 2003, Gelmi, 1996, Livingston, 1997, Duffy, 2006, Eklund et al., 1996, and by apologetic documents, starting from the Liber Pontificalis. Second, in 2,000 years the papacy had to face a wide array of historical circumstances, from the barbarian invasions to internal power struggles, from exiles to change of residence, from schisms to multiplications of the number of converts, as well as relations with all sorts of political regimes. To all these circumstances the popes had to react, thereby revealing information about their personality and, what interests us most, about the nature of their regime. We evaluate this information not only to see to which of the four types of dictatorship each period of the papacy seems closer, but, most of all, to argue that never has the papacy taken any new and distinct form. There are two ways to carry out this analysis. One is to categorize all the popes, 263 from St. Peter to Benedict XVI, antipopes excluded, according to the official records, to see who most closely resembles the democratic type, who the tyrant, and so on. This exercise would be rather sterile, first because it is quite difficult and arbitrary to define where a difference of behavior among two popes legitimizes putting one before and the other beyond the line separating two types of dictatorship. Second, because such an approach would deal more with the personal temperament of the popes than with the objectives, the constraints and the shocks that the papacy was facing in a particular period, which is what really matters for our purposes. We thus prefer a comparative statics approach, whereby we look at periods of the papacy and examine how it responded to an external shock that, according to the political exchange model, should make it evolve from one type of dictatorship to another. Popes in a certain period are, on the average, tin pots, tyrants or totalitarians. We limit the examination to the period when the papacy exerted in fact some temporal power, thus to a time interval stretching from the end of the 5th century, with the pontificate of Gregory the Great, to 1870, when the Kingdom of Italy conquered Rome. Limiting the sample to the temporal power avoids overstretching the concept of theocracy, which the literature always conceives as a political regime over a given territory. Moreover, the temporal power enabled the papacy to develop a domestic policy, in terms of the rule of the Papal States, that provided the Pope with some freedom of action and most of the financial means necessary to carry out his international policy. This consisted not merely in the relationships between the Pope and other states and empires, but in his guidance of the Church and of all the Christians, even when they were subjects of other states. This link between the Pope's domestic and international policy provides the basis both for our comparative statics exercise and for the classification of the papal regimes. The comparative statics looks at how shocks to the ability of the popes to raise revenues domestically and from the Church at large affect the money into power and power into money functions. An increase of revenues from the Papal States, due to an extension of their territory, tax base, or to an improvement in their administration increases the Pope's ability to act and can be interpreted as an upward shift of his power into money function diaresis. That is, any given level of diaresis now translates into a higher budget, as shown in Figure 4. The result is more power and a higher budget, as shown in the new equilibrium in Figure 4. If the Pope has more power and a bigger budget, that should increase the likelihood of a totalitarian papacy. Conversely, a change which reduces the power and budget of the papacy should increase the likelihood of tin pot popes. These are the two categories used by Islam and Weiner, 2004, and their empirical tests of the dictatorship model on secular, contemporary regimes using indexes of freedom, yet, that distinction between the domestic and international policy of the papacy allows us to infer how much repression and loyalty was used in every period, making it possible to identify also the off-diagonals, that is, the tyrant, high repression, low loyalty, and conceivably the timocrat types, high loyalty, low repression, though we do not use this last category here. The point is that the Pope may rule within the territory of the Papal States using a combination of loyalty and repression, but can only rely on Catholic loyalty to pursue his international policy. Having no army, the Pope can only count on the devotion and reverence of the faithful who are subjects of other, secular, political powers. When a pope uses an expansion in his capacity to raise revenue to increase his power both domestically, by means of repression and or loyalty, and internationally, by means of loyalty only, we have a totalitarian popate. Gregory VII, with the subjugation of the Roman families and successful excommunication of the emperor, is the clearest example of this type. When the greater resources are used only to repress in the Papal States, without increasing the Pope's stance abroad, as in the case of the popes of the Restoration, we have a tyrannical papacy. A tin-pot papacy generally follows a tightening of either or both of the constraints, that is, a fall in the capacity of the Pope to raise revenue, inward shift of the bi-diaresis curve, or of his capacity to convert money into power. I-diaresis B, tends to produce tin-pot popes. See figures 3 and 4. Such popes appear unable to play any international role nor to control matters at home, as during the so-called Dark Century of the papacy, approximately between the 10th and the 11th century. Finally, it is conceivable that there are examples of timocratic popes, who used only loyalty to pursue both their domestic and international policy. An example might be Nicholas V, who ruled by providing public goods at home, by restoring the city's buildings and infrastructures, and abroad, by brokering peace deals. However, this claim would have to be buttressed by further research, and we confine ourselves here to the three categories: tin-pots, tyrants, and totalitarians. 4.2 Historical analysis and classification of the popes. In 1,300 years of temporal power, many events affected the papal regime and the behavior of the popes. Most of the historical and encyclopedical sources, for example, Hilaire, 2003, Kelly, 1986, Livingston, 1997, Duffy, 2006, concurrent, affirming that at least 9 major events, what we may refer to as permanent structural breaks, affected the papal regime. The establishment of some territorial dominion during the 6th century, the ensuing loss of it after the Lombard invasion, and the contemporaneous strengthening of Byzantine rule in southern Italy, the creation of the Papal State under Charlemagne, the crisis of the empire during the 10th century, the economic renaissance after the year 1000, the captivity of Avignon, the return to Rome, the reform, and, finally, the demise of the Papal State under Napoleon. Not all these events have the same historical importance, and others could make the list, but these are the ones that all our sources consider as turning points. We consider them in turn: I. Totalitarian, the barbarian invasions of the 4th and 5th century and the 20 years long war between the Byzantines and the Goths in Italy left the peninsula depopulated and impoverished. In a sense, this was a boon for the Church, with Constantinople far away and its representative, the Exarch, powerless and secluded in Ravenna. The Church emerged as the sole authority left in all that misery. At those times many of the traditional Roman families bequeathed their vast land holdings to the church before becoming extinct, or their progeny retired from the world and took the clerical or monastic vows. Saint Benedict is the most famous example. This transfer of land provided the first financial underpinnings to the Church of Rome, while the large influx of highly cultivated people made available a large workforce to carry out its activities steadily and efficiently. In terms of the theory of dictatorship, these developments can be represented by an outward shift of the power into money by diaresis function, as depicted in Figure 4, because, at any level of diaresis, the Pope is now able to raise more revenue. The pontificate of St. Gregory the Great is the best example of this shift. A learned monk from a very wealthy Roman family, with immense estates in Sicily, the only region untouched by invasions, Gregory set about reorganizing the patrimony of the Church, making it the largest landowner in the West, and its hierarchy, filling it with efficient and well-trained monks. Duffy, 2006. The extra revenues thus generated allowed the Pope to provide protection to his subjects threatened by barbarian invasions and to buttress his claims of superiority to the other patriarchs before the emperor. Gregory's victory in this controversy immensely raised the prestige of the Roman pontificate. Was in fact to the Pope that the population of Italy and the West increasingly turned in order to receive spiritual comfort and protection from the barbarians, the two most important public goods sought at those times. Gregory was also the first pope to start a truly missionary activity, conforming the liturgy of the newborn Church of Ireland to the Roman one, and converting Anglo-Saxon England. All these activities can be seen as an upward shift of the power into money function, because they marked the beginning of the ability of the Church to raise revenues and provide public goods beyond the territories under its direct rule. All in all, Gregory's pontificate marked two developments relevant for the application of the theory of dictatorship to the papacy. First, it provided the essential features for the application of the theory, as he was the first pope to organize a political power over territory. Second, he claimed, and to a great extent secured, a great deal more authority over the spiritual life of the believers and succeeded in converting many who were not. This spiritual authority in turn reinforced his temporal power. In his use of both loyalty and repression to advance his power, Gregory appears to fit the description of a totalitarian ruler. 2. Tin Pot. After Gregory's death, the papacy lost the dominance over many of its territories, both because of high turnover of popes in the first half of the 7th century. There were 10 elections between Gregory's death and Martin I's accession in 649, and because of the expansion of Byzantine rule in southern Italy, having to fight terrible enemies, the Avars, the Persians and finally the Arab armies, the empire squeezed all the resources it could from the lands not under barbarian rule. The papacy yielded, both because of the lack of all continued guidance, but most of all because the battles of the emperor were seen as holy wars. The Persians had initially conquered the Holy Land, while the Arabs subtracted all Asia and the southern Mediterranean from Christianity. Out of those continuing crises arose a close identification between the Church and the Empire, with the Emperor looking the defender of Christian religion much more than the Roman Pontiff. The Pope again became subjected to the Empire. In terms of temporal power, the estates of the Church returned under the Byzantine rule and fisc. Of political prestige, it became compulsory that the elected pope receive the approbation of the emperor before he could be consecrated, and, most of all, in terms of religion, to avoid a division from Constantinople, Pope Honorius I had to compromise the doctrinal purity of the papacy by accepting the Byzantine's theory of monothelitism. Two natures, divine and human, coexisted in Jesus, but only one divine will, against the Roman canon of two natures coexisting in one person. 9. During this period of Byzantine captivity, the Pope's ability to exert repression and to command loyalty suffered. From the theoretical point of view, both the money into power and of the power into money functions appear to have shifted inwards. The popes were left with the minimum to subsist and manage the organization of the Church in Rome, with no possibility to direct missionary work. In a word, they looked like taint pots. 3. Tyrant. The situation changed significantly when Popes Zacharias, Stephen II and Hadrian I struck an alliance with the kings of the Franks and re-established the papal state in the second half of the 8th century. Pepin and later Charlemagne subtracted central Italy from the Lombards and donated it to the Pope. Upon these territories the Pope ruled on behalf of St. Peter, under the protection of the Holy Roman Empire. The stabilization of the temporal power, justified by the famous forgery of the donation of Constantine, in part recreated the situation of the reign of Gregory the Great. The Pope was able to raise revenues in his lands, as the establishment of the Domus Sculti, lands earmarked as the Pope's private property, the organization of a land army and the restoration of Roman churches and aqueducts testify. In terms of the model, these events can all be interpreted as an increase in the capacity to raise revenues at any given level of power, an upward shift of the power into money function. Consequently, the Pope was able to increase repression in his territories. But the international policy of the Pope was severely limited. Charlemagne made it clear that Christians were to be loyal to the emperor first and foremost. Imperial power came directly from God, not from the successor of Peter. The Pope was to be approved by the emperor, just as under the Byzantine captivity and so were bishops. Even in matters of religious dogmas Charlemagne took the leading role. Barraclough, 1968. Livingston, 1997. In brief, the increased temporal power did raise the Pope's powers of repression at home, but it did not augment loyalty to the papacy, neither within the Christianorum Res Publica, nor among his new Roman subjects. In 799 Leo was mobbed by a crowd led by the nephew of his predecessor and had to flee to Padovano under Charlemagne's protection. Overall, the situation of the popes of these times resembles that of Nicholas I. The struggles between the emperors over the divisions of the empire throughout the 9th century and a new wave of barbarian and Arab invasions. The papacy in fact became the possession of the great Roman families, the Theophylax, the Crescentii, the Tusculani, who regarded it as a ticket to local dominance. Many of the popes bribed their way to the Holy See. Some were elevated from the status of layman to pope in one single day. Most had mistresses. Pope John XI, for example, was the illegitimate son of Pope Sergius III and of his mistress Morosa Theophylact. No wonder that the 10th century is remembered as the dark century of the popes. Political power and repression was in the hands of the Roman families, and loyalty to the popes was nowhere in evidence. A third of the 40 popes elected between 872 and 1012 died in suspicious and often horrendous circumstances, with a few notable exceptions, chiefly that of Gerbert of Aurillac, Pope Sylvester II. These popes were all tin pots, to all appearances interested in consumption. One of them, Benedict IX, the only man who served as pope for 3 discontinuous periods, was eventually given 650 kilos of gold to abdicate. Allegedly he needed the money to marry 11. The instability of the papal regime of those times can be interpreted as implying that those popes were near to or below the I circumflex minutes line, that is, the line depicting the minimum level of power necessary to stay in office. V. Totalitarian. During the 11th century a series of shocks contributed to restore the power of the papacy. They can be understood as outward shifts of the money into power and of the re-established the close links between the empire and the papacy of the times of Charlemagne. Otto III regained Ravenna and the Pentapolis for the papal state, greatly increasing the revenues for the pope. Also the economic boom that characterized Western Europe after the year 1000, due to a restored confidence that the world was not about to end and to technological advances in agriculture, improved the Pope's finances. Other forces can be seen as shifting outwards the money into power. IDRSSB function. For example, the empire staffed the hierarchy of the Roman Church with its own men and clergy, raising the ability of the papacy to collect revenues and preventing their appropriation by the Roman families. But by far the most important development of these years was the Cluny reform. Cluniac monks promoted a change of the behavior of the Church, fighting corruption, simony, the acquisition of religious offices by cash payments, clerical marriage, and generally raising the spiritual and educational standards of the Church. Tentrilla, 1993. The very rapid spread of Cluniac monasteries and of ordained monks is evidence of the great loyalty that this movement commanded and transferred to the Church in general. When the Cluny movement captured the Curia and papacy, the Pope was again able to receive assets, both financial and in terms of human capital, from sources outside its temporal power. Most of all, Cluny's statute marked a stark innovation compared to all other Christian institutions which had existed previously. First the Cluniac monks and then the papacy were granted complete freedom. In the words of the Duke William of Aquitaine, founder of the first Cluniac monastery, "From our power, from that of our kindred and from the jurisdiction of royal greatness, until then, religious freedom meant freedom under the king." According to the Cluniac movement it meant freedom from the king, among other things, the election of Cluniac popes Leo IX and, most of all, Gregory VII, resulted in a remarkable change of ideas and of regime. Gregory VII's Dictatus Papae turned the relationship between the Church and the Empire on its head, compared to the ideas of Charlemagne. Under the new set of rules, the Pope alone is universal Catholic. He is the only who can call general councils, authorize or reform canon law, depose or translate bishops, that is, move them to another diocese. Most of all, for the first time the Pope claims the power not only to create, but also to depose emperors, to refuse them the sacraments, excommunication, and to absolve the subjects from their wicked rule. Never had the papacy claimed so much power. The Pope used it to increase repression in the papal states and to command unprecedented loyalty. The effect of excommunication of Henry IV, who had to go to Canossa barefooted to ask for pardon, made it clear to whom the allegiance of individual subjects and barons went. Even in Germany, the century between the Canossa and the rise of Emperor Frederick II, beginning of the 13th century, saw 19 popes between Gregory VII and Innocent III, 11 of which were monks, and marks the pinnacle of papal power. Urban II launched the crusade that freed Jerusalem from Muslim control. Alexander III successfully confronted Frederick Barbarossa. The popes started to travel and to spread their ambassadors, the nuncios, all over the world. making the papacy a truly international institution. Moreover, these are the years when the monarch and curie established the legal machinery that immensely consolidated the papal authority and ability to govern. Examples of this legislative production are the Liber Sanctum, an exhaustive account of all sources of papal funding designed to maximize revenues, Duffy, 2006, and the Concordia Discordantium Canonum, a method proposed by the monk Gratian in 1140 to sort out legal disputes when laws are conflicting or unclear. Innocent III, probably the most powerful pope ever existed, extended papal power in Italy, adding lands in the March, Tuscany, Campania and Umbria to the papal state, intervened in succession disputes as far as in Norway, disciplined the Mass and what came to be known as the Christian Orthodoxy in the Fourth Lateran Council, that 20 settled the doctrine of transubstantiation, and promoted two new great monastic orders, the Franciscans and the Dominicans. This is the period of the truly totalitarian papacy. 12. Tyrant. All this assembling of power eventually backfired on the papacy. The pope behaved like a true monarch, with its machinery of power, the canon law, his court, the curia and large number of subjects and financial resources. But as the 13th century progressed, the papacy would gather around itself more and more the trappings of monarchy. After the reform of the papal election in 1059, which transferred from the Roman aristocracy to the conclave of the cardinals the power to elect the pope, the cardinals developed a strong sense of collegiality that eventually evolved into opposition to the power of the pope and provided the basis for the doctrine of the superiority of the council to the pope. Moreover, as the papacy became more international, it forfeited Roman loyalty. The establishment of the Roman commune during the 12th century made the city an increasingly unsafe place for the popes, who were constantly threatened with revolution. Three of them, Eugenius III, Hadrian IV and Alexander III, were temporarily driven out of the city by the citizens, while Lucius II died of wounds sustained while storming the Capitol Hill. Finally, the empire reacted to the expansion of the power of the Church, with Frederick II invading the Papal States, and receiving the loyalty of the Ghibelline party in Italy against the papal supporters, the Guelphs. The split between Guelphs and Ghibellines, which did not exist at the times of Innocent III, shows that loyalty to the Pope was on the decrease. The papacy was nonetheless still able to effectively rule and exert oppression on its territories, as the establishment of the Inquisition in 1231 illustrates. High levels of repression with lower levels of loyalty are a sign of a tyrannical dictatorship, and it is no accident that most historians of the Church, or chroniclers such as Dante Alighieri, depict the Pope that best epitomizes this period, Boniface, as a tyrant. 7. Tin Pot. After Boniface VIII, the popes moved to Avignon for 70 years. And upon their return to Rome, the Great Schism began and lasted 39 more years, until the Council of Constance solved it in 1418. In this century, the high papal prestige and unchallenged papalist theory of the era of Innocent III were gone forever. The popes from Martin V to Nicholas V faced the task of reconstructing Rome and the papal state and re-establishing the credibility of the papacy in the community of all the faithful under an enduring political weakness. So we classify all these popes as tin pots. 8. Tyrant. 4 events contributed to the restoration of papal authority during the Renaissance. The inconclusiveness of the councils after Constance discredited the conciliar movement and restored the papal authority the possibility of raising revenue in new original ways. such as the pilgrimages and the Holy Years. The further evolution of the administration and jurisprudence of the papacy, far superior to any of the then emerging nation-states. The economic boom that followed the Black Plague of the 14th century and the human capital boom that was the Renaissance all contributed to the increased power of the papacy. But these Renaissance popes do not appear totalitarian. They are best understood as tyrants. The increased revenues were used not to buy loyalty abroad but in a competitive attempt to outshine other princes and to wage wars against other princes, as in the case of Alexander I and Julius II. Most of all, the popes became secularized to the point of failing to understand the spiritual unease that bred the reform. 9. Tin Pot. This period begins in 1534, when the kingdom of Clement VII, marked by the sack of Rome of 1527, ended. From that time onwards the popes were never able to attain the international standing that they used to have. The reform diffused the power of excommunication, since the outside political powers could opt out of Catholicism when in deep conflict with the Pope, and possibly also seize the wealth of the Church, as Henry VIII did in England in 1534. The consolidation of the modern nation-states further eroded the loyalty to the popes. They increasingly had to surrender to the demands of the European monarchies, even in matters related to the Catholic Church, such as in the case of the expulsion and then dissolution of the Jesuit order by Clement XIV in the 18th century. Many of the popes of the 17th and 18th centuries simply enjoy the papacy, to use Leo X's famous expression. They used it to promote the wealth and political stature of their families. These centuries are the heyday of nepotism, as well as the arts and culture. Baroque Rome was built in these times, but as time passed and the resources of the papal state became increasingly exhausted, the popes of the 17th and 18th century retrenched from a tyrant type of behavior to essentially a tin pot type of behavior. Even the most powerful instrument of repression then in the hands of the popes, the Inquisition, backfired. In the age of the Enlightenment, the blatant injustice of the process to Galileo caused immense damage to the prestige of the popes and of the Church in general, and further reduced the loyalty it was able to summon from the most advanced quarters of society. The rise of Napoleon brought the temporal power of the Church to an all-time low. In 1799 Pius V was brutally removed from Rome when terminally ill and died in Valence without a Christian burial. The official obituary then released announced a broken bar the death of Citizen Braschi, exercising the profession of pontiff. In 1808, the French occupation of Rome produced the first demise of the papal state and the annihilation of the temporal power, as well as the consequent imprisonment of Pius VII between Rome, Savona and Paris. Tyrant. The experience of the loss of the temporal power and the fear that it might happen again became the drivers of the policy of the popes of the Restoration. Pontiffs like Leo XII or Gregory XVI tried to secure their rule over the papal states by means of concordats, closure to all new ideas brought about by the Revolution, or even liberalism in support of the French and Austrian armies. Repression mounted, and the temporal power of the popes became a byword for obscurantism and backward government. 13 It was an awkward spectacle that the father of all the faithful should rule seated on foreign bayonets, after his subjects made him flee in 1848. In a sense, also the declaration of the dogma of the infallibility of the Pope by the First Vatican Council in 1870 was a response to his failing temporal power. The lack of loyalty and the use of repression make the Restoration popes, the last to hold the temporal power, appear as tyrants. In this rather brief historical excursus, we have used the theory of dictatorship to illuminate the behavior of the popes by showing how the regime reacted to shocks that affected its domestic and international policies. These shocks produced different types of popes which we have tried to capture using the categories of dictatorship, tin pot, tyrant and totalitarian. Figure 5 summarizes the analysis with a timeline of the papal regimes. The next sections use this classification to test some implications of this model. Figure 5 about here. 5. Durability and opposition to the papacy. 5.1. Durability. One of the most straightforward predictions of the political exchange model of dictatorship is that tin pot regimes are characterized by the maximization of the dictator's consumption under the constraint of staying in power. Whatever extra resources the tin pot receives are used for his personal consumption, not to strengthen his power. The ensuing relative weakness of the tin pot regimes makes it more likely that they are overthrown by opposing forces. Ceteris paribus, a tin pot dictator should thus be shorter-lived than a totalitarian and/or tyrannical dictator. The papacy is an excellent testing ground for this hypothesis. First, being a single regime that comes in different dictatorial variants, it provides the ceteris paribus condition mentioned above that is lacking in the contexts where the political exchange model has been tested previously. 14. Second, unlike recent times, when the Pope usually reigns until his death, in the good old days it was often the case that popes abdicated. Celestine va broken Barchafus Previlte Dio Gran Refutal 15 is the most famous example, were deposed, 2 of them even consecutively, Leo VIII and Benedict V, murdered. Leo V, John X, died of an heart attack when elected. Stephen II, in March 752, of wounds suffered when storming Rome's Capitol Hill. Lucius II, and even served 3 non-consecutive terms and then resigned to marry their mistress. Benedict IX. The probability of such premature endings of a pope's kingdom, and hence its durability, is negatively correlated with his political strength. But even in more recent times, when accidental finales went out of fashion, many conclaves chose to elect an old and feeble pope in order to solve the stalemate, at the cost, or with the explicit intention, to have a short and weak papal regime. According to many commentators, in 1958 the election of John XXIII, 77 years old when raised to the Holy See, was intended to provide a short transition to a younger pope who would then modernize the Church after the difficulties of the papacy of Pius XII. But Pope John XIII's calling of the Second Vatican Council suggests that the Holy Spirit held different views than the cardinals. We can draw on the classification exercise described in Section 4 and on the long time series and wealth of information provided by the papacy to test the following model. Durability diaresis 1/2 diaresis diaresis age diaresis life diaresis yen 0 1 2 3 type 2. The model is deliberately left as simple as possible not to impose too much theoretical structure on historical data. The variable durability is approximated as the number of days in which Pope I reigned, since the day of his election to the day when he ceased to be Pope. These dates are according to the official records of the Annuario Pontificio, available from www.tatipopi.it. The regime type is a vector of 3 dummy variables, tyrant, totalitarian and tin pot, which take the value of 1 when the category occurs in 0 otherwise. The categorization follows the comparative statics exercise of the previous section, which looks at regime shifts rather than at the characteristics of the single popes. The dummy variables thus determine a series of long-lasting intercept shifts. Had we chosen to the alternative approach and categorized all the single popes, we would have obtained a much greater variability of the type covariates and ensured a much better fit of the model. The choice of remaining consistent throughout the analysis slants the specification of the model against our hypothesis. Any empirical support for the durability hypothesis is even stronger evidence of the predictive power of the political exchange model. The variable age marks the age of Pope at the time of his election. It is drawn from Kelly, 1989. As this information is often missing, especially for the popes of the Middle Ages, we report the results of the estimates with and without the variable age, Model I and Model II, respectively. Finally, a life captures the life expectancy of the popes at the time of their life. Following to the recent findings of Eppen and Vopel, 2002, a life is modeled as a simple 26 linear trend. Differences in life expectancy of the average individual and of a member of the elite like a pope amount to a parallel shift of the function. The expected signs are A10 when type equals totalitarian, since the intercept then captures the case of the tyrant pope, whose durability should lie between the tin pot and the totalitarian A1. 6. Conclusion. This paper attempts to see if the working of theocracies can be understood in the same way as other dictatorships. On the one hand, it seems apparent that a regime like contemporary Iran, which is largely controlled by the Muslim clergy, is special and has many unique characteristics. On the other hand, the same can be said about almost any political regime. Hannah Arendt, in her justly celebrated book The Origins of Totalitarianism, 1950, lumped together Stalin's Russia and Nazi Germany under the same label totalitarianism, yet it is obvious that the two regimes were very different in many respects. But while it is important and vital to discover the history and peculiar characteristics of every political regime, it is also useful to have broad abstract categories. The word democracy is one such category, and the essential characteristics of democracy can be spelled out and regimes characterized to the extent that they are democratic on various empirical measures. We believe the term dictatorship is equally useful. From Wintrobe's 1990-1998 model of dictatorship, for special types can be derived: totalitarian, tin pot, tyranny and timocracy, that vary in the extent to which the ruler uses loyalty or repression to stay in power. Here we test the explanatory and predictive power of this theory of dictatorship by applying it to theocracy. We consider the behavior of the Catholic theocracy and the Papal States, as this was a very long-lasting theocracy, exposed to many historical shocks that reveal information about the incentives and constraints that characterize it. We use this information to test the explanatory power of the theory of dictatorship, showing that never in the history of the temporal power of the Church have the four categories of dictatorship proven inadequate. In this sense, theocracy is just like any other form of dictatorship. Furthermore, we test some of the predictions of the theory of dictatorship about the durability of, and the source of opposition to the various regimes on data about the papacy. The results appear to support the theory.